Hi guys, welcome to the second lesson in the algebra unit. This lesson is going to deal with inequalities, so a lot like solving equations, but we're dealing with inequalities. And again, probably pretty straightforward, but we'll do a little bit of review and remind you of a couple of little places you might get caught up. First of all, remember that you know from early on in your math that less than or greater than uses an open dot when you graph. But now we've learned that we can use parentheses with that. And less than equal to and greater than equal to both use a closed dot, but now we're using brackets for the interval notation. And so we're going to be solving inequalities, but we're going to be remembering some of these rules along the way. So this first one, I'm going to use a rule that we learned last lesson, and that is instead of distributing that 2, I'm going to divide it out. And the only reason is it's going to be a little bit easier for me. Instead of making it a longer problem, this will make it a shorter problem. And so I divide out the 2, so that 2 goes away. This 90 gets divided by 2, and I have 5m plus 5 is less than 45. Now I just finish out the problem. I'm going to subtract my 5, and then I'll divide by that other 5. And so when I do that, I get the answer of m is less than 8. But of course, we have been working with interval notation, and we now know that instead of using a less than, we're going to say everything less than 8. Maybe let's try to graph that first. Let's graph it, and then we'll talk about what to do. Okay, your number line, you can number wherever you want. We need to be at least up to 8, though, so I might start like at 3. As long as 8 is on my line, it's fine. All right, it used to be I would use an open circle for this and put it on the 8 and then shade everything to the left, correct? But now I'm not using that open circle now. I want to use these parentheses instead. It is less than 8, and so I'm going to draw it like this. So I have my parenthesis at the 8, and I go to the left. That's how I'm going to graph it on the number line. And then I'm going to think about how to write this as an interval notation. Well, it starts over here at negative infinity, and it goes all the way to 8. And again, I use the parentheses because it doesn't actually get to 8. And so this is my answer in interval notation, and this is how I graph it using that interval. Similar concept of the interval notation there on the graph. Okay, let's look at the next problem. Okay, one thing to point out is on number 1, I could divide by 2 because that's all that was going on the left. I could divide by 4, but not yet, because first I have to move that 3. And if I divided by 4 and I didn't move the 3 first, I would mess things up. Because here's the deal, we haven't talked about this, but when you solve equations or inequalities, either one, you have to go in PEMDAS order backwards. In other words, you have to do your adding and subtracting first, and then your multiplying, and then your exponents, and then your parentheses. So we have to start with our adding and subtracting. So we have to subtract this 3 before we can do anything else. So that's important for you to remember to do that PEMDAS backwards. All right, so now I have 4 times 4k. Okay, now a minute ago I said I could divide by 4. I still could. But if you look at what I have on the right, neither one of those is divisible by 4. So I don't think I'm going to divide by 4. That's going to give me some fractions, and I don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and distribute this out. All right, now I have just a basic equation that I want to solve. As always, especially with the inequalities, I was pretty lenient with this on the equations, but with the inequalities, I really want to keep the variable on the left. That's pretty important with inequalities. With equations, it's not as big of a deal, but with inequalities, we should do that. So in other words, I want to subtract this 5k, add my 24, and I've run out of room, so I'm going to come up here and keep writing up here. And so I get as my answer, k is less than or equal to 3. All right, once again, it doesn't really matter where on my number line that is. I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3. As long as I have the 3 on there and it's kind of towards the middle, that's fine. So now I need to graph it. This time I have an equals with it, and so I need to use my square brackets, and it's less than again. So it's going to go this way. So that's my graph on that number line. Then I need to give my equation or my answer in interval notation. Remember, we always use parentheses on the infinity because we never get to infinity. But the 3, it has a bracket this time because it says equal to. And so we're going to make sure we have that equal to bracket. The only last thing you might want to do is check your answer. And on these inequalities, when you check your answer, when you plug it back in, it probably is going to be equal to. Let's just kind of give it a mental check. Get your calculator and let's try it with a calculator. So when I plug in a 3 here, I'm going to get 12 minus 6, that's 6. 6 times 4 is 24. 24 plus 3 is 27. And when I plug it in on the right-hand side, I'm going to get 12 plus 15. That's also 27. So when we plug it in, we get the equal to part of it. And that would work over here as well. If I plugged in my 8, that's 40. Plus 5, that's 45. That's going to be 90. So I get 90 over here. And of course, I start with 90 over there. Well, it says less than. So when you plug it in, what you're actually plugging in is like that one spot where you've put the end of your number line, basically. If you wanted to see if you were pointing the right way, you could plug in a number over here on the left. So for this example, maybe I would plug in like a 0, because that's an easy number to plug in, and see if it works. In other words, does it make it less than? So if I plugged in the 0, I'd get 2 times 5, that's 10, and over here I still get the 90, and yes, 10 is less than 90, so I must be pointing the correct way. Same thing over here with my 3. Since it went to the left, maybe I should pick something lower, like 0, and plug in a 0 and see if that works. If I plug in a 0, I get negative 24 plus 3, that's a negative 21. And I plug in a 0 over here, I get 12. Well, yes, negative 21 is less than 12, so I did point it the right way. So checking your answer, when you plug in your check, what you're really checking is just the end point. If you want to plug in to see if you're pointing the right way, then you have to pick a different number from your number line. All right, let's look at number 3. Once again, I have to do my subtraction before I can do anything else. Okay, I subtract my 7, I've got 82. I could just divide by 2. You don't have to, you could distribute that. But I just would rather make it a smaller number problem instead of making it bigger. And so this is going to be a little bit easier for me. So I finish up my problem, I get y is less than 7. And so I go to my 7, it's a parenthesis because it's less than, not equal to. And this means that my interval answer would be a negative infinity all the way up to 7. Okay, so this section is basically a little bit of review from the problems we were doing yesterday and just throwing in some interval notation. Number 4 has a fraction in it. There's a couple different things you could do. I would like to isolate that fraction. I just think it's a better idea to keep that fraction by itself instead of having this big ugly thing with it, okay? So in other words, what I'm saying is I'm going to go ahead and add that 6 to the other side. Now, do you remember what I said to do when you have a fraction? Okay, I'm going to multiply both sides by 16 or 16 over 1. So that's going to cancel those 16s. I'm going to get x is greater than negative 16. So to graph it, again, I can start anywhere, maybe negative 20. Okay, I went ahead and just numbered by 2's because I was getting too crowded. So x is greater than 16. The only thing that's a little bit different about this one is we haven't done a greater than example yet. So this one's going to be greater than, pointing this way. Okay, again, we have our parenthesis, greater than goes that way. So in our answer, in our interval answer, we're going to start with our negative 16 and go up to infinity. We always start with the lowest number and go up to the highest number. And so this is my interval answer, and this is my graph. Okay, those were just basic review problems. Remember that there's sometimes when you switch the inequality sign. Do you remember what the rules are for switching the inequality sign? There's a couple different ones. Okay, the first rule, which probably you remember, is you switch the sign when you multiply or divide by a negative number. So let's take a look at number 5 and work on it and see what we come up with. Okay, the first thing on number 5 is PEMDAS backwards says I have to add 7 to both sides. So my adding and subtracting comes first with PEMDAS backwards. So add that 7. I get a negative 6 times 1 minus 2n is less than negative 90. Okay, that little shortcut that we're kind of working on is instead of distributing that out, I can divide by a negative 6 because 6 does go into 90 evenly. Okay, but what did I just do? I just divided by a negative. And the rule is when you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to switch the sign to point the other way. So this negative 6 is going to cancel out, and I have a 1 minus 2n, but I have to flip my sign to point the other way. Anytime you divide by a negative, that's what happens. And the 90 gets divided by 6, well, negative 90 divided by negative 6, which is a positive 15. And so now I can subtract that 1, and now I have to divide by another negative. And so if I divide by this negative now, I then have to switch my sign again. And so I get n is less than negative 7 as my answer. Now, if we had done it the other way, maybe we wouldn't have had as much switching going on. But because we did it this way, we had to switch it here, and then we have to switch it again because we divide by negative 2. So we get n is less than negative 7. So here's my 7. I'm going to have my parenthesis, and it's less than, so it's going to the left. I don't know if you've ever learned this, but less than sounds like left. And so you're going to less than and left go together, okay? In addition, the arrows are pointing the same way. This arrow is pointing the same as this little pointy, okay? That's another thing that happens. I'll also mention that some of you might have learned it different ways. In other words, I've been drawing my line a little bit ambiguously. Sometimes it's not really on the line, and well, I guess mostly it's not really on the line. You can do it either way. Most of you learned, I think, to put it not on the line like this, and that's fine. If you want to put it up on the line itself, you can do that. That's okay too. Sometimes it's just easier to see when it's kind of floating up there, but you could put it on the line too, okay? Last thing is our interval notation. And so interval notation is from negative infinity up to negative 7, parentheses on both. All right, number 6. Once again, PEMDAS backwards, subtract that 2 first thing. If you knew what 161 divided by 7 was, you could divide that. That's just not something I know off the top of my head. It looks like it would go in, and we could do that pretty easily if you're good at mental math, but I don't just know that off the top of my head. So I'm just going to go ahead and distribute. And so when I distribute, I get 161 is greater than 35c plus 56. I need to subtract my 56. I'm running out of space, so I'm going to come up here. Okay, so I have 105 is greater than 35c. Well, a couple things. I mentioned this a bit ago, but you really want to have that variable on the left. Maybe let's go ahead and finish this out. So we need to divide by 35. You might need your calculator for this one. Some of you might know it in your head, but either calculator or mental math, what do you get when you take 105 divided by 35? You get 3 is greater than c. Okay, but I really do not want that variable on the right. The variable belongs on the left, especially in inequalities. So we need to move it. We need to put the c on the left and the 3 on the right. This is the other time that you basically are going to change your sign to point the other way. So over here in the margin I wrote down, when you move a variable from right to left, or from left to right, but since we did this, take a look. See how it was pointing at the c? So we're going to stick with pointing at the c. c is less than 3. Anytime you have to move it, the c is still on the less than side, the 3 is still on the greater than side. I don't like the alligator thing, but the alligator's still eating whatever it was eating before. It's still eating it. So now our number line. All right, c is less than 3. Going to 3, making a parenthesis. It is less than, so it's to the left, and that is my answer there. My interval answer would be from negative infinity all the way up to 3. Okay, 2 more examples. This first example, I'm going to start off by dividing by negative 4. And when I divide by a negative 4, what do I have to do? I'm going to have to flip my signs. So I know that that is a positive 31. But since I divided by a negative, I point the other way, and I get 8x minus 1. Now I'm going to add my 1 to the other side and divide by 8. I need to put my x on the left-hand side. So I'm going to write my answer with my x on the left, my 4 on the right. It was pointing at the x. It needs to continue to point towards the x. So if I put this on my number line, this time square bracket, still less than. Okay, square bracket on the 4, it's less than. My interval, what would my interval be? All right, my interval is negative infinity to 4. Last problem. I think you can do this one on your own. Do you know how to get rid of that 4 in the denominator? Take a second to do number 8. Okay, this one didn't even have any switching of the signs, right? Y is greater than or equal to negative 8. No signs needed to be switched. Let's go ahead and set up our number line. Greater than or equal to negative 8 should look like this. And our interval goes from negative 8 to, negative infinity to negative 8. Okay, and that's it. All right, we learned quite a bit here, a lot of review, but also some new things. So what do you need to remember? Write down at the bottom some things that you need to remember. You can talk about the braces, the brackets, and the parentheses. You can talk about the open circle, closed circle. You can talk about when you switch the signs and when you don't. Just some different things to remember from today's lesson. Write them down here. Also, as always, if you have questions, write your questions in the margin. Bring those questions to class tomorrow, and we can work on them in class tomorrow. And that's it.